Welcome to the Locating Confidential Data Stored On-Premises and in the Cloud module of the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15.5 Administration course. In modern organizations, data can be found in a variety of locations. When discussing data loss prevention, it is critical for technical staff to understand the significance not only of data in motion, but also data at rest. Although data can be found moving around the network at an almost constant pace, files stored on a user's workstation and backed up automatically to Box or some other off-premise location are often overlooked. Performing a rudimentary inspection of SharePoint repositories often turns up files that contain sensitive data but have been hiding out in the file system, all but forgotten. Temporary file locations can also be a concern because remnants of files that have been downloaded locally can also contain sensitive information. Another concern is insider threat. Although most companies use significant resources to safeguard the internal network from malicious outsiders, very little attention has been given to the internal person, whether malicious or simply unaware, who may take or disseminate information from inside the network. With sensitive data stored all over the network, for instance in file shares, databases, email servers, and clients, users could be accessing and using confidential data stored on those repositories inappropriately. Discovering where confidential data resides in on-premise repositories or cloud storage accounts and endpoint computers is critical for assessing baseline data loss risk for your organization, and it is an essential step towards reducing the proliferation of confidential data and tightening access controls and securing data, for instance through quarantine or encryption. When you reduce and secure your organization's confidential data at rest, you can go a long way towards reducing the risk of such data exiting your network unauthorized, whether by loss or theft of laptop computers, or by well-meaning or malicious insiders sending confidential data outside your network, or even by malicious outsiders hacking into your network and attempting to exfiltrate confidential data. With an ongoing data loss prevention program of regular, incremental scanning for confidential data across your organization's data repositories and endpoint computers, you can greatly reduce your risk of data loss over time. In this module, you will learn how Symantec DLP can assist in locating confidential data in on-premises repositories, cloud storage accounts, and endpoint computers. The business objective of this module is to locate confidential data stored on-premises and in the cloud. To address this objective, this module will cover the following topics: determining where to search for confidential data, locating confidential data on corporate repositories, locating confidential data in the cloud, and locating confidential data on endpoint computers. Determining where to search for confidential data. In this topic, we'll discuss the process for identifying where confidential data resides in an organization. The previous Identifying and Describing Confidential Data module of the Symantec DLP Administration course discussed the importance of working with various internal stakeholders to identify an organization's confidential data and to create Symantec DLP policies to detect such data. When it comes time to find that data residing in on-premises repositories or cloud repositories and on endpoint computers, collectively known as data at rest, you need to 1. Work with key stakeholders to identify potential repositories to scan and the likely types of confidential data stored in them. 2. Confirm which repository type Symantec DLP supports for scanning. And 3. Finalize the list of repositories to scan and the policies to apply in these scans. After completing this topic, you will have a better understanding of these important steps for identifying where confidential data resides in your organization. In this process, it is important to ask critical questions about data location and severity. Who owns the data? Who will be affected if we lose it? Where is it stored? Can we access it? And are we in compliance with data laws? It is critical to work with departmental data owners and stakeholders to map out potential locations of confidential data across the organization. Data owners and other stakeholders can help you focus your search for confidential data at rest by pointing you to departmental repositories, which can include Exchange servers, SQL database servers, SharePoint servers, cloud storage accounts, and so on. The first step is to identify the primary data owners and other key stakeholders whom you should contact in the beginning stages of this process. Data ownership is often decentralized and can therefore be difficult to determine. You may need to consult with a wide range of staff, including technical personnel, executives, business partners, and third-party vendors. When performing this step, it is also essential to clarify the types of data that may be present and who will be affected in the event of an incident. Additionally, Data owners are often knowledgeable about the specific compliance and regulatory requirements that apply to the data for which they are responsible. Identifying data owners can be accomplished by approaching departments and discussing what data belongs to them and who is responsible for it. Another technique is to look at current data classifications, which can offer information on who the appropriate data custodians are. It is important to include data owners and related stakeholders in this process because it can reduce the risk of improperly identified or misrepresented data and to give data owners the opportunity to review compliance and data security best practices. Involving a diverse set of staff in your data loss prevention efforts can improve the effectiveness of the program. Symantec understands the need for companies to maintain data in many different environments with many different storage requirements. As such, Symantec DLP supports the scanning of many different types of storage locations within an organization's network and in the cloud, as indicated in this figure. You can scan on-premise repositories such as file servers, SharePoint, SQL databases, and web servers. Note that in addition to all repositories Symantec DLP supports out of the box, you can also scan nearly any other repository type through the use of a web services custom scan offering. You can also scan cloud storage repositories such as Box. Finally, you can scan for confidential data on hundreds of thousands of endpoint computers in your organization. In situations where endpoint scanning is needed, but an agent cannot be installed, such as on contractors' laptops, agentless scans are also available. For the latest list of supported repository types, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements Guide. In subsequent topics of this module, we will discuss which individual products of the Symantec DLP suite support which types of scanning for data at rest. After you have reviewed the repository type Symantec DLP supports for scanning, you should make a list of the specific locations within your environment to scan, noting the types of data that might exist in each instance and the compliance requirements surrounding these data types. For instance, file servers and endpoints could house spreadsheets with protected health information, PHI, whereas a Box Enterprise account might be home to old Word documents with customers' credit card information that was backed up automatically but unknowingly. Other locations may be less obvious, such as SQL database servers that track confidential project milestones, or Exchange servers with email concerning a potential merger. Come up with a list of specific repositories or targets to scan in your environment, and make note of the DLP policies you plan to apply to each, and confirm your list with stakeholders. Keep in mind that this initial list should prioritize the scanning of high-risk targets, those that are accessible to many users and that are likely to contain large amounts of confidential data. It is a best practice to revisit and update this list over time, noting which specific repositories have received an initial base scan and adding any new repositories to scan in the future. In summary, data at rest is just one click away from becoming data in motion and leaving the network. It is therefore important to be proactive by locating, in order to eventually protect, the confidential data scattered through the corporate environment. Determining the appropriate data owners and key stakeholders helps establish an environment of cooperation and compliance. Data owners often have a more detailed understanding of their data and potential security implications associated with it. Perform a thorough review of data repositories in your environment, and confirm Symantec DLP support for scanning these repositories. Drafting and updating a well-reviewed master list of specific repositories to scan reduces the risk of overlooking potentially critical data locations. Locating confidential data on corporate repositories. In this topic, we'll discuss how to configure and scan each of the supported on-premises repository targets. Now that you have a working list of repositories to scan and policies to apply, you can use Symantec DLP to search for confidential data at rest in your environment. In this topic, we'll cover scanning on-premise repositories such as file servers, SharePoint servers, and so on. Confidential data residing in on-premise repositories is at risk for data loss for several reasons, including unnecessary proliferation of data across multiple repositories, loose access controls that provide access to too many users, and unsecured data, for instance, unencrypted confidential data, that sit exposed on file shares. You must clean up this data to reduce the risk of well-meaning insiders or malicious actors accessing it and then sending it outside of your network. The first step in controlling confidential data at rest is to locate it, and many organizations start with scanning on-premise repositories because they hold so much data and are accessible to so many users. Symantec DLP Network Discover lets you scan on-premise repositories for confidential files, and its companion product, Network Protect, lets you quarantine or take other actions on discovered confidential files for supported repository types. As described in the Overview of Symantec Data Loss Prevention module of the Symantec DLP Administration course, Network Discover relies on an architecture comprised of the Enforce server, one or more Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers, and, for some repository types, small agents called scanners, which are installed on the repository host server. This figure depicts basic Symantec DLP Network Discover architecture and shows how it captures incidents. The Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server mounts a remote file system, reads the files it contains, and inspects them for violations. Using Network Protect functionality, it then copies, encrypts, quarantines, or unquarantines confidential files found in the scan. Incident responders can also invoke custom manual responses based on the Symantec DLP Flex Response API to change access control lists or ACLs on files and so on. Note that this topic covers only Network Discover features. For details on Network Protect features, please see the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of the Symantec DLP Administration course. And for details on encryption, please see the Enhancing Data Loss Prevention with Integrations module. The types of file repositories Network Discover can scan include any file system accessible from Windows or Linux, including CIFS, SMB, NFS, DFS, and others. For file system scans, Network Discover uses the underlying operating system on the Discover server to mount and scan the remote file system. Windows file shares are the most common target for Network Discover scans. In addition to file system scans, Network Discover supports native scanning of Lotus Notes databases and any SQL database accessible via JDBC or ODBC, for instance Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, and IBM DB2. Network Discover can also scan Exchange and SharePoint repositories. To facilitate the scanning of certain targets, Symantec DLP offers server-based agents called scanners. These are typically installed on the target host. Scanners natively connect to the target repository to scan it and send data back to the Discover server as XML over HTTP. Scanners send only extracted text and metadata back to the Discover server for analysis, thereby saving bandwidth. Scanners are available for websites, such as public websites, intranets, wikis, and so on, and for specific applications such as Documentum and LiveLink. Customers can also write their own custom scanners that send data back to the Discover server via a data discovery API, thus enabling the scanning of essentially any data repository. The rest of this topic will cover basic requirements for Network Discover, and then go into detail on configuring targets and running scans to detect confidential files residing in on-premise repositories. Network Discover depends on an architecture consisting of an Enforce server and one or more Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers. To scan on-premise repositories for confidential data, you must ensure these components are installed. In general, it is a best practice to locate the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server close to the target repositories, for instance in the same data center, to facilitate faster scanning and to minimize the impact on network bandwidth. Scanning rates will vary depending on the target type, but a single Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server can, for example, scan file servers at a rate of up to 23 gigabytes per hour. For details on installation, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Installation Guide, which has different versions for Windows and Linux. And you can review the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Install and Deploy e-learning course. For the latest DLP system requirements, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements and Compatibility Guide. After installing the required components and configuring them to communicate with one another, the next step in implementing Network Discover is to ensure you have configured DLP policies that tell Symantec DLP what to look for when scanning on-premise repositories. As described in the Identifying and Describing Confidential Data module of this course, Symantec DLP policies generally apply to all products in the Symantec DLP suite. For instance, a single policy can be used to detect credit card numbers across storage, network, and endpoint, with different response rules tailored to the specific Symantec DLP products you have deployed. After you have deployed the required Symantec DLP architecture and authored policies to detect confidential files, you are ready to configure targets and run scans in on-premise repositories in your organization's environment, as detailed in the next section. To scan a repository, start by configuring a Network Discover target, which sets parameters for scanning in the Enforce Administration console. The target, which is specific to the repository type, lets you specify applicable policy groups, Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers, whether a scan is a full or incremental scan, whether more than one Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server will be used to perform the scan, entitled grid scanning, and whether the scan will run on a regular schedule or pauses during certain hours. You can also provide the network credentials for scanning, as well as the specific repositories and directories called content routes to scan. Finally, you can configure scan filters for file size, file modified or file access dates, and so on. Advanced settings for scan throttling, automated remediation tracking, and so on, as well as settings for copy and quarantine actions. When Network Discover detects confidential files on Windows content repositories, Network Protect can quarantine them or release them from quarantine, or encrypt them in place through integration with Information-Centric Encryption or ICE, or alternately apply customized automatic responses built on the Symantec DLP Flex Response API. The quarantine location, which is specified in the target configuration, is generally a secured folder on a remote file share that is accessible to the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server through the corporate network. As part of a quarantine response, you can also create a marker file that replaces the quarantined file in the original location and indicates to users what happened to the original file. Quarantine is available for SharePoint servers and for file servers that support the CIFS protocol. Network Protect Quarantine and other response rules are covered in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course. Symantec DLP's Information-Centric Encryption, or ICE, is available for Windows file servers and SharePoint servers. This feature will be covered in the Enhancing Data Loss Prevention with Integrations module. The earlier topic, determining where to search for confidential data, provided tips for creating a working list of repositories of all supported types to scan for confidential data. For file servers specifically, there are a couple of additional Network Discover features you can use to build out your list of scan targets. 1. Auto-discovery of servers and shares, called Content Root Enumeration, which lets you locate servers and shares within a domain that you can then add to your scan configuration. Secondly, Inventory scanning lets you do quick preliminary content scans against your DLP policies to determine whether any confidential data resides on potential file server scan targets. You can configure an incident threshold, after which Network Discover discontinues scanning a target and moves on to the next target. After identifying file servers with confidential data in this manner, you can go back and perform full scans on the file servers when convenient. This section will cover Content Root Enumeration scans first, and then explain inventory scanning. Content Root Enumeration, or CRE, enables the discovery of CIFS-compliant servers and shares residing on the customer premises. CRE scans produce a list of servers and shares that you can use directly in file system targets for Network Discover scanning or export to a CSV file. A Content Root Enumeration scan does not scan the content of the servers and shares it discovers, but it enables you to find the servers and shares in your domain and then configure automated scanning of them. During a CRE scan, the Enforce server will pull a list of servers from Active Directory and then use DNS to resolve the IP addresses as needed, to interpret and implement scan filters, for example. This process is shown in this figure. If you configure the scan to identify shares in addition to servers, Enforce connects to file servers using JCIFS and identifies open shares. Enforce then writes the list of servers and shares to the Oracle database, as shown in this figure. As indicated in this figure, the benefit of a CRE scan is the ability to add lists of servers and shares to a Network Discover target for scanning file systems. Configuring targets and running scans are covered later in this module. Remember that CRE scans require the Enforce server to have a connection to an LDAP directory server, as well as access to all servers and shares you want to scan. For more information on setup for these steps, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. After you have created a connection to your directory services infrastructure, you can configure and conduct the CRE scan. To configure a CRE scan, log into the Enforce Administration Console and navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Content Enumeration, and then click Add Scan. Type a name for the scan, select a directory connection, choose whether to enumerate servers only or both servers and shares, and then configure at least one filter for IP range or server names, as shown in this figure. When you're done, click Save. To run the CRE scan, check the box next to the scan you have just configured and click Start, as shown in this figure. Note that you can click the DLP Refresh button in the top right of the Enforce console to review the status of the initiated scan. The status column will indicate complete when the scan finishes. You can then review scan details for information on locations that might contain confidential data. For further details on CRE scans, please refer to the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. Inventory scanning is used during the discovery phase of a DLP deployment to determine if confidential data resides on a target machine or repository. Inventory scanning is available for several on-premise repository types, including file servers, SharePoint servers, Exchange servers, SQL databases, and Lotus Notes. It is also available for Box, which will be covered in the topic Locating Confidential Data in the Cloud later in this module. Inventory scanning allows for preliminary discovery and audit without scanning entire servers or shares. After the scan reaches the configurable incident threshold, it moves on to the next server or share specified in the target configuration. After you have determined that confidential files exist on specific servers and shares, you can go back and perform full scans of these targets at a later time. Since inventory scanning is an option within target configuration, it is mentioned at relevant points within the individual sections on target types that follow. Network Discover scans network file servers and shared resources called shares, including disk drives or directories, in order to discover confidential data. Network Discover supports CIFS-compliant file servers and file shares using CIFS, NFS, DFS, or any other client. Network Discover can also scan Microsoft Outlook personal folders, PST files, on network file shares. The content root enumeration scan discussed in the previous section is helpful here because it enables you to discover file system content roots within your domain. To create a target for scanning a file system, in the Enforce Administration console, go to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets, then select New Target, Server, File System. The screenshot shown here will show you an example configuration. Note that if no other policies are available, the default policy group is selected automatically. On the Targeting tab, shown here, select the Discover server or servers that will perform the scan, and then select the scan mode. The available scan mode options are 1. Use single server for scan. Selecting this option uses the Discover server you selected to perform scans. If more than one Discover server is selected, Symantec DLP automatically chooses a single server when the scan starts. Secondly, use all selected servers for scan in a grid. This option enables the grid scanning feature, which distributes the scanning workload across multiple Discover servers. Note that you must select at least 2 servers to use grid scanning. Symantec recommends that you apply the same configuration to all the Discover servers that you intend to use for grid scans. Note that for grid scanning to function properly, port 61616 must be opened for all Discover servers involved in the scan, particularly if the servers are in different data centers. On the Scanned Content tab, shown in this screenshot, you can configure scan credentials and specify the content roots, meaning servers and/or shares in this case, to scan. You can either directly type the scanned credentials here, or you can select Save Credentials. Saved credentials can be configured at System, Settings, Credentials. There are several ways to specify content roots. 1. Type the servers and shares you want to scan and select Add Content Roots by Direct Entry. Information entered here takes precedence over default values and applies only to the path specified. Second, import a list of servers and shares detected by a content root enumeration scan by clicking Add Content Roots from a content root enumeration scan. From the Select a Content Root Enumeration Scan for Import drop-down list, select the scan you want to import, then click the Import button. Third, import a list of servers and shares contained in a text or CSV file by selecting Use Content Roots from an uploaded file. First click Upload File, browse to and select the relevant file, then click Upload File again. Go to the Filters tab to configure Include and Exclude filters, or File Size filters and File Date filters, as shown in this screenshot. Use Include filters and Exclude filters to specify the files that Symantec DLP should process or skip. You can use wildcards as in asterisks to match any sequence of characters, and question marks to match single characters, as well as specify absolute paths using either / or / for Windows, or / for Linux as directory separators. Separate multiple filters with a comma and no spaces. When both include filters and exclude filters are present, exclude filters will take precedence. Go to the Advanced tab to select options to throttle scanning, configure scanning of PST files, or specify scanning of administrative shares, as indicated in this screenshot. You can also configure preferences for automated remediation detection, so that Network Discover records remediation that has taken place since a previous scan of the same location. Select Item Modified to track cases where the relevant policy has not changed since the last scan, but the item no longer triggers an incident. Select Policy Modified to track cases where the relevant policy has changed since the last scan, so that the unmodified file no longer triggers an incident. Select Item No Longer Exists to track cases where the confidential file has been removed. If you select any automated remediation detection options, Network Discover records the selected remediation types in the individual incident reports, or incident snapshots. Refer to the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide for detailed information on filtering and advanced remediation options. The last configuration tab in a file system target is the Protect tab, where you can authorize copy, encrypt, and quarantine actions for discovered confidential files, and specify the quarantine location and any credentials required for copying confidential files to that location, as well as specify any additional credentials required for writing marker files to the original location. The screenshot here shows the options on the Protect tab. Network Protect actions such as copy, encrypt, and quarantine are covered in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of the Symantec DLP Administration course. After saving the target, you can run it manually or wait for it to run according to a schedule you configured for the target. To run the target manually, navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets. Select the target, then click Start Scan. After the scan starts, by default it runs until all content routes have been scanned, pausing during any period specified in the target. You can also pause and stop the scan manually, as indicated in this screenshot. These scan controls are available not just for file system targets, but also for all Network Discover target types, including SharePoint, Exchange, and SQL database targets, as well as Cloud Storage Discover and Endpoint Discover targets, which will be covered later in this module. To see historical scan information, including the general status of a current scan, do one of the following. Navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Scan History, and locate the relevant scan in the list. Or, from the target entry at Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets, click on the Scan Status indicator for the entry. The Scan History page has entries for all, or a filtered list of, historical scans. As indicated in this screenshot, these entries provide high-level scan overviews, including scan started time, scan type, incidents generated, runtime, and bytes or items scanned. From individual entries on the Scan History page, you can click the Scan Status indicator, for example, completed, to access the Scan Details page for that scan. You can also click the arrow icon in the Actions column to access incidents captured by that scan. As shown in this screenshot, the Scan Details page shows detailed statistics for the scan, including general information such as target name and type, scan type, and start-end times. It also includes scanned statistics, such as items scanned, errors, and current incident count, as well as recent scan errors and recent scan activity. Links on the page will take you to full reports on scanned statistics, errors, and activities, which can be useful for getting a detailed view of an ongoing or historical scan and can aid with troubleshooting. During and after a scan, you can access captured incidents in a couple of ways. 1. Navigate to Incidents, Discover, to see all incidents for all Network Discover, Cloud Storage Discover, and Endpoint Discover targets. You can filter this master incident list to see incidents from particular targets, for instance, as described in the Remediating Data Loss Incidents and Tracking Risk Reduction module of the Symantec DLP Administration course. Secondly, in the entry on the Scan History page for a particular scan, you can click the arrow icon in the Actions column to see a summary report for incidents captured just by that scan. You can then click on Summary Categories in the Summary Report to see incident lists for those categories. In an incident list, you can review high-level details of incidents that fit the current report filters. As shown in this screenshot, incident lists include incident entries with highlights such as Network Discover scan type, original file location, the DLP policy that captured the incident, policy matches, incident severity, and incident status. Incident lists also include custom filtering options. All these elements of incident reports are discussed in the Remediating Data Loss Incidents and Tracking Risk Reduction module of the Symantec DLP Administration course. Here, you should simply become familiar with the contents of a Network Discover incident snapshot. The full incident snapshot, which contains all information about a given incident, is accessible by clicking on the relevant entry in the incident list. An incident snapshot contains all information about a given incident, including incident type, incident status and severity, and policy violations, broken down by policy rule. Network Discover incidents also include details about the scan that captured the incident, the discovered confidential file, and access permissions on the file. The incident snapshot also shows the specific pieces of confidential content that were found in the discovered file, and that triggered the incident by violating DLP policies. Incident snapshots for the other various Network Discover target types are essentially similar to the incident shown in these figures. Network Discover can scan a wide range of SharePoint items for confidential data as defined in your DLP policies, including SharePoint Server 2010 SP2, 2013 SP1, and 2016. To take full advantage of Network Discover's SharePoint scanning capabilities, in addition to enforce the Oracle database and one or more Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers, you will need to install the Symantec DLP SharePoint solution on all web front-ends WFEs in a SharePoint farm, as indicated in this figure. The SharePoint solution uses Windows SharePoint Services, or WSS, application programming interfaces. Verify that you have sufficient permissions to install the SharePoint solution on the WFEs in a farm. For details on obtaining and installing the Symantec DLP SharePoint solution, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. Note that Symantec DLP also offers an option for scanning SharePoint repositories without having to install the SharePoint solution, but there are some limitations to this approach. For instance, you lose the ability to scan at the web application level, or fetch granular permissions for SharePoint items, or use Flex Response functionality. For details on enabling SharePoint scanning without installing the SharePoint solution, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15.5 Administration Guide. Communication between a Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server and the SharePoint WFE is SOAP-based. If the specified SharePoint site is configured to be on a port that is not the default, port 80, ensure that the SharePoint server allows the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server to communicate on the required port. User access to the content in SharePoint is based on the rights for the specified user in SharePoint. You must specify the correct user credentials to enable appropriate access when you configure a SharePoint target. Also verify that the scan user has the required network permissions to run the scan of the SharePoint server. To configure a target for scanning SharePoint, navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets. Then click New Target, Server, SharePoint. On the General tab shown in this screenshot, type a name for the target and select the policy groups in the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers to apply to this target. Note that if you do not choose one or more specific policy groups, the default group is automatically selected. Next, choose whether scans based on this target will be incremental or full, and if incremental, whether the first scan will be a full scan followed by incremental scans afterwards. You also have the option on this tab to configure a schedule and any pause windows for scans based on this target. You can override a target's pause window by going to the Discover Target screen and clicking the Start icon for the target entry. The pause window will remain intact, and any future scans that run up against the time window will pause as specified. You can also restart a paused scan by clicking the Continue icon for the target. On the Targeting tab, select the Discover server, or servers if you want to perform grid scanning, that will perform the scan. Additionally, under Scan Mode, select Use Single Server for Scan to run scans using only one Discover server, or select Use All Selected Servers for Scan in a Grid to enable the grid scanning feature, which distributes the scan workload across multiple servers. To perform grid scanning, you must select at least 2 Discover servers. When you initialize the grid scan, one of the servers is assigned the role of the grid leader, which coordinates the actions of the other servers. On the Scanned Content tab shown in this screenshot, enter the credentials for this scan, keeping in mind that accounts used for scanning must have a SharePoint permission level of full control, design, or contribute. Next, select an authentication mode to indicate the type of credentials you are providing. Windows is an Active Directory account. Forms indicates a forms-based account in a custom membership database separate from Active Directory, such as SQL Server or an LDAP membership provider. Claims indicates credentials submitted to an identity provider as part of a process to obtain a security token, which is then used to access the SharePoint server. Currently, the only identity provider Symantec DLP supports is Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. The value you specify in the Federation Service Name field is the URL of the Microsoft ADFS server. Next, specify the SharePoint sites to scan. For each site, enter a target URL to the SharePoint web application, site collection, or site to be scanned. All items in child sites and subsites are scanned. Configuration examples are shown in this screenshot, and for additional examples, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. You can add SharePoint locations in two ways: upload a plain text file or enter individual locations. If you choose to enter locations manually, these path entries take precedence over values specified in an uploaded text file, but only apply explicitly to the path specified. Note that when scanning SharePoint repositories without using the SharePoint solution, you cannot use a web application as a content route for the scan. Instead, you must manually extract site collections to use as content routes. For details on how to do this, refer to the section To Enumerate Site Collection URLs in the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. Similar to file system targets, SharePoint targets also offer optional filters in throttle settings. Additionally, you can configure a SharePoint target to perform inventory scanning. This screenshot shows details about the configuration options available under the Filters and Advanced tabs. The last configuration tab in a SharePoint target is the Protect tab, where you can authorize quarantine actions for discovered confidential files, specify the quarantine location, either SharePoint or in the file system, and then any credentials required for writing files to that location, as well as specify the write access credential for the original location of the files being quarantined, if it is different from the read access credential for this location. The screenshot shown here shows the options on the Protect tab. Network Protect actions such as SharePoint Quarantine and Unquarantine, called Release from Quarantine, are covered in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of the Symantec DLP course. Note that the Network Protect Quarantine File Automated Response Rule action, discussed in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course, and the Network Protect SharePoint Quarantine Smart Response Rule action, which is discussed in the Remediating Data Loss Incidents and Tracking Risk Reduction module, enable Symantec DLP to quarantine confidential files stored in SharePoint 2013 and 2016 repositories without requiring the SharePoint solution to be installed on the web front end of your SharePoint farm. Running scans, monitoring scan progress, reviewing scan details and history, and reviewing resulting incident snapshots are all essentially the same for SharePoint targets and file system targets. For details on these features, review again the File Systems section of this topic. Network Discover can scan Microsoft Exchange Server for confidential data that violates your DLP policies, and no agent is required. Network Discover supports Microsoft Exchange Server versions 2010 with Service Pack 3, 2013 including 2013 with Service Pack 1, and the on-premise version of 2016. The Exchange Auto-Discover service is used to fetch Exchange Server and mailbox information directly from Active Directory. It then pulls data directly from the relevant Exchange servers for analysis, using the Simple Object Access Protocol, or SOAP. Network Discover locates a range of exposed confidential data on Exchange servers, including email messages, calendar items, contacts, journals, and flagged items. At a high level, the steps for scanning Exchange are as follows. Step 1. Verify that Exchange Web Services and Auto-Discover service are enabled on the Exchange server and are accessible from the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server. 2. If you require secure access between the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server and Exchange Web Services or Active Directory, set up HTTPS and LDAPS. By default, Network Discover uses secure connections to the Exchange and Active Directory servers. Step 3. Ensure that the credentials you plan to use for scanning can impersonate all the mailboxes you want to scan. Then, Step 4. Create an Exchange target. And lastly, run a scan of Exchange. To configure a target for scanning Exchange, navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets. Then click New Target, Server, Exchange. Configuration options for an Exchange target are very similar to those for file systems and SharePoint servers, so they will not be covered in detail again here. On the Scanned Content tab, shown in this screenshot, enter the credentials for the scan. All Exchange usernames must include the domain name, using the format domain name /username. Ensure that the user credentials you provide can impersonate all mailboxes you want to scan. Complete the configuration by entering the Active Directory URL for Exchange Auto-Discover in the Directory Server URL field. In addition, select the specific content to be scanned, as well as select all users or just specific users for scanning. For more detailed configuration information, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. Network Discover can also scan SQL databases for confidential data that violates your DLP policies. This can be useful, for instance, if you have customer service agents entering potentially confidential customer information into comments or notes fields in the database. Network Discover supports scanning of the following databases: Oracle version 11G, 11.2 or higher, 12CR1, 12.1 or higher, and 12CR2, 12.2 or higher. Also, Microsoft SQL Server versions 2014 and 2016, as well as IBM DB2 10.5. The high-level steps for scanning SQL databases are as follows. Step 1. Ensure that a JDBC driver for each type of SQL database to be scanned is installed on the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server. Second, create a Network Discover SQL database target. Then run the database scan. To configure a target for scanning a SQL database, navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets. Then click New Target, Server, SQL Database. Configuration options for a SQL database target are very similar to those for file systems, SharePoint servers, and Exchange servers, so they will not be covered in detail again here. On the Scanned Content tab shown here, enter the SQL database credentials for this scan. When specifying databases to scan, you can either upload a text or CSV file containing a list of databases, or you can enter database information manually. Any credentials you include in manual database entries take precedence over the default user configured on the Scanned Content tab in the target. Specify the databases using the vendor name, Oracle, DB2, or SQL Server, and the data source, which is the subname of the JDBC connection string for that driver and database. The documentation for the JDBC driver will describe this subname. Optionally, also include the maximum rows to scan per table in the database. This figure illustrates the two methods for specifying the databases to scan: file upload and manual entry. The screenshot here also includes some sample database strings for each database vendor. For additional configuration information, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. In summary, scanning on-premise repositories for confidential data at rest is a critical part of a DLP program. It helps you understand the baseline risk in your organization and serves as a starting point for cleaning up exposed or redundant confidential data on your network. Content root enumeration scans help you identify file servers and shares to scan for confidential data, while inventory scanning, which is available for most Network Discover target types, helps you quickly identify repositories that contain confidential data so that you can note those repositories for full scans at a later time. Network Discover lets you scan most on-premise repository types, including file servers, SharePoint servers, Exchange servers, and SQL databases. Locating confidential data in the cloud. In this topic, we'll discuss the process for configuring cloud-based targets. As organizations make greater use of cloud storage, confidential data is finding its way into the cloud. It is now just as important to scan cloud storage accounts as it is to scan on-premise repositories, and the urgency will grow significantly in the coming years. Organizations need to understand whether confidential data has been uploaded to cloud storage accounts so that they have a better idea of usage patterns and data loss risk, and so they can take steps towards securing this data. Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover uses an on-premise Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server to scan the contents of corporate cloud storage accounts. The current product version supports scanning of Box Enterprise accounts, which are widely used in many organizations. Cloud Storage Discover lets you see what confidential information is stored in your employees' accounts, and the people with whom your employees have shared that information, and how that information is shared. For instance, whether confidential files are password protected, or if they are accessible through links that are available to unauthorized users. The product also lets you quarantine confidential files, or add configurable visual tags, indicating internal use only, for instance, to confidential files. The quarantine response supports secure relocation of files to an account in Box itself, or to an on-premise location. This figure depicts basic Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover architecture and shows how it captures incidents. The Cloud Storage Discover server scans Box Enterprise accounts and analyzes file contents for policy violations or incidents. Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover can automatically add visual tags to files. Note that this topic will cover scanning only. For details on using response rules, see the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this Symantec DLP administration course. Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover is built on an architecture comprised of Enforce and one or more Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers. Scanning rates will vary, but Cloud Storage Discover can scan at a rate of up to 23 gigabytes per hour. For details on the installation, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Installation Guide, which has separate versions for both Windows and Linux, or review the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Install and Deploy training module. For the latest DLP system requirements, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements and Compatibility Guide. After installing the required components and configuring them to communicate with each other, the next step in implementing Cloud Storage Discover is to ensure that you have configured DLP policies that tell Symantec DLP what to look for when scanning on-premise repositories. As described in the Identifying and Describing Confidential Data module of this course, Symantec DLP policies generally apply to all products in the Symantec DLP suite. For instance, a single policy can be used to detect credit card numbers across storage, network, and endpoint, with different response rules tailored to the specific Symantec DLP products you have deployed. After you have deployed the two-tier Symantec DLP architecture and authorized policies to detect confidential files, you are ready to configure targets and run scans on cloud storage. Similar to Network Discover, Cloud Storage Discover requires you to configure a target that specifies which accounts to scan and how to scan them. Targets must include administrator or co-administrator credentials, with privileges for managing users and groups and downloading files. Targets may optionally include any box-specific filters for users and groups, or files and folders, or collaborative folders, and files and folders with shared links, along with standard filters for file types, file size, etc. Note that collaborative files are tracked and scanned only once. Cloud Storage Discover does support incremental scans. Cloud Storage Discover Quarantine and other response rules will be covered in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course. Before discussing the use of Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover to scan cloud vendor storage accounts, it is worth highlighting the fact that Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers can provide visibility into certain cloud-hosted repositories. In addition to the on-premise support covered in the topic Locating Confidential Data on Corporate Repositories of this lesson, Network Discover also supports scanning the following targets when they are hosted in the Amazon Web Services or AWS cloud: file share servers using CIFS, Microsoft SharePoint servers, and Microsoft Exchange Server. Refer to the Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements and Compatibility Guide for the supported versions of these targets. The latest version of this guide can be found on the Symantec Support Knowledge Base at support.symantec.com. Note also that Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers are supported for deployment in the AWS cloud. This figure shows an example architecture in which the Enforce server and two detection servers run on-premise, while a Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server runs in the AWS cloud, where several repositories also hosted in the AWS cloud can be scanned. Although it is not depicted in the illustration, a Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server hosted in AWS can also scan Box repositories. When using Network Discover to scan AWS-hosted repositories, the target configuration is the same as for scanning on-premise versions of these repositories, with one exception. You must specify the internal AWS IP address as the target location. Otherwise, you can refer to the Locating Confidential Data on Corporate Repositories topic for detailed instructions on configuring targets for the supported AWS-hosted repositories. It is important to note that Symantec DLP cannot scan the AWS platform itself, but rather supported repositories that are hosted in AWS. For more information on Symantec's support of AWS, see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Deployment Guide for Amazon Web Services, found on the Symantec.com website. Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover can scan Box Cloud Storage targets to discover confidential data. You can scan user files and folders, collaborative folders, and files or folders with shared links. You can configure automated response rules to quarantine and apply visual tags to confidential files discovered in Box Cloud Storage. This figure shows an architectural overview of Box scanning, with the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server located on-premise. Cloud Storage Discover requires explicit authorization to access content in Box. This is configured in the Enforce console, where you need to create a cloud authorization on the System Settings Cloud Authorization page. The authorization is based on information provided by a custom Box Enterprise application that you need to create on the Box developer site. To create the Box Enterprise application, log on to https://app.box.com/developers/services with an administrative account and create a new Box app with the following settings. The app type set to Enterprise Integration. The authentication method set to Standard OAuth 2.0. The application name called Symantec Data Loss Prevention. Under Application Scopes, select all of the following: read all files and folders stored in Box, read and write all files and folders stored in Box, manage users, manage groups, manage enterprise properties, and manage retention policies. Under OAuth 2.0 Redirect URI, enter the Enforce server's URI, that is, the Enforce server's FQDN or public IP address. Before you can use the custom Box Enterprise app, it is necessary to enable additional privileges that are not available from the Box developer site. Therefore, you will need to contact Box to enable the following settings. As user, admin can make calls on behalf of users, admin or co-admin can make calls for any, and can suppress email notifications from API calls. For more detailed information on these steps, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide. After your Box Enterprise app has been configured with the necessary privileges, the Enforce server requires the client ID and client secret from the Box app in order to create a Box Cloud Storage authorization. In Enforce, go to System, Settings, Cloud Authorization, and then click New Cloud Storage Authorization, Box. In the Client Configuration section, enter the client ID and client secret from your Box application. This figure here shows a portion of the Box app settings and the corresponding fields in Enforce. To use Cloud Storage Discover to scan Box, the following is required: a Box Enterprise or Business Plan account, a Box Cloud Authorization in Enforce, Internet access for the Enforce server during the configuration of the target, and Internet access for the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server while scanning Box. Additionally, it is recommended that you have a dedicated co-admin user account under which to run scans. This user will need Manage Users and Manage Groups privileges, as well as permissions to download the files to be scanned. As with other Symantec DLP scan types, you must configure one or more targets to govern scans of Box. To create a target, in the Enforce Administration console, navigate to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets. Then select New Target, Box, On-Premises Detection Server. On the General tab, enter a target name, select the applicable policy groups, select the Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover server, or servers if there is more than one in your environment. Specify the scan type, whether full or incremental, and optionally configure a schedule for the scan. For Symantec DLP to scan your Box environment, you must authorize Cloud Storage Discover to access the Box account using a valid Box Cloud authorization. Use credentials with Box admin or co-admin privileges for the content you want to scan. The credentials you use must also include permissions to download the files to scan. In the target, click the Authorization tab, Click Authorize, then type the box credentials in the dialog box that appears. Click Authorize again when finished, as shown in this figure. Use the Filters tab to configure a wide variety of scanning filters, including several tailored for box users and groups. Under Users Groups, you can choose to scan all box content or limit the scan to selected groups and/or users. You can also configure options for filters on user folders, whether all, private folders, external and internal collaborative folders, or external collaborative folders, and for shared links, not password protected, with no expiration date, and/or with download permissions. The remaining filter options for box targets are the typical include-exclude file type filters, file size filters, and file date filters common to most Symantec DLP target types. The Advanced tab in a box target has the throttling and inventory scanning options common to most Symantec DLP target types, while the Protect tab includes configuration options for quarantining or marking discovered confidential files with visual tags, as shown in this figure. You can add visual tags to help box users search for and self-remediate confidential files. For instance, you might want the tag to read, "This content is confidential." You can also remind users of additional security features of Box, such as adding password protection to any download links. You can quarantine sensitive content stored in the Box repository. The quarantine location can either be on Box or in an on-premise file share. You can optionally choose to leave a marker file in place of the quarantined content. For visual tags in quarantine to work, you must configure the appropriate response rules and policies that apply to this target. These protective actions are discussed in more detail in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course. Running the box scan, reviewing scan progress and scan history, and reviewing scan details and log reports are essentially the same for box targets as for file system targets, as described in the file system scanning section of the topic Locating Confidential Data on Corporate Repositories within this module. Incident snapshots for box incidents are also similar to file system incident snapshots, discussed earlier in this lesson. However, there are some box-specific differences. As shown in this figure, box incidents include the box user and the file name, along with collaborators and associated roles, and shared link details, such as download permission, expiration date, and whether the link is password protected. In summary, Symantec DLP enables companies to extend data loss prevention to the cloud. This enables technical staff to scan for data at rest beyond the boundaries of a traditional infrastructure. Network Discover can scan Amazon Web Service hosted file servers, SharePoint servers, and Exchange servers. In addition, Network Discover Cloud Storage Discover servers are supported for deployment in AWS environments. Cloud Storage Discover can scan box repositories and then quarantine and add informative visual tags to discovered confidential files. Symantec DLP offers box-specific filters to tailor scans and provides box-specific information within incident snapshots. Locating confidential data on endpoint computers. In this lesson, you will be able to describe the function of Symantec DLP Endpoint Discover and how to configure it to scan for confidential data on employees' laptops and workstations. Just as organizations need to identify and later protect confidential data residing on shared corporate repositories, they also need to identify confidential data residing on endpoint computers on their networks. Confidential files on endpoint computers can easily be compromised if a laptop is lost or stolen, or if the user sends such files outside the company, whether intentionally or unintentionally, or if hackers access the endpoint computer, for instance while the employee is working at a hotel or coffee shop. Understanding the amount and types of confidential data residing on endpoint computers is a critical step in assessing your organization's risk, as well as tailoring access to confidential files and eventually preventing the transmission of such data from endpoint computers. Symantec DLP Endpoint Discover lets you scan hundreds of thousands of endpoints for confidential files. For Windows endpoint computers that can quarantine confidential files, or via the FlexResponse API, execute custom responses on them. As described in the overview of Symantec Data Loss Prevention module of this course, Endpoint Discover relies on a three-tier architecture comprised of the Enforce server, one or more endpoint servers, and compact DLP agents that are installed on the endpoint computer. Note that these same components also power the other Symantec DLP endpoint product called Endpoint Prevent, which monitors and blocks the transmission of confidential data from endpoint computers, as described in the Understanding How Confidential Data is Being Used module of this course. This figure shows the basic Symantec DLP endpoint architecture and shows how Endpoint Discover captures and stores incidents. First, the DLP agent will scan local drives on the endpoint computer for policy violations. If there is a violation, response rules are initiated locally. Even if the endpoint computer is disconnected from the network, the agent will still perform detection and incident response. The incident data is encrypted and written to disk regardless of whether there is a connection. When a connection is available, the agent will then send incident data and extracted text from detected files to the endpoint server for additional detection if needed. The endpoint server will send all incident data to the enforce server, and the enforce server will store incident data, initiate additional response rules as required, and display the incident in the user interface. The rest of this lesson will cover basic requirements for Endpoint Discover, and then go into detail on how to configure targets and run scans to detect confidential files residing on endpoint computers. Endpoint Discover depends on a three-tier architecture consisting of enforce, one or more endpoint servers, and DLP agents running on endpoint computers. To scan endpoint computers for confidential data, you must ensure that all of these components are installed. For details on installation, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Installation Guide with separate versions for Windows and Linux, or review the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Install and Deploy e-learning course. Details on creating and installing DLP agent packages are also available in the Understanding How Confidential Data is Being Used module of this course. The DLP agent is a compact, stable agent that runs on a variety of Windows and Mac OS versions. Note that there are differences in endpoint prevent functionality between DLP agents for Windows and Mac, and these will be highlighted at the appropriate parts of this module. The agent consists of several components, including a primary agent service, a watchdog service that ensures the primary service continues running, and an encrypted agent store that contains deployed policies and holds incidents until they are sent to the enforce server through an endpoint server. Upon initial installation, the DLP agent will require approximately 70 to 80 megabytes of disk space and 25 to 30 megabytes of RAM, and the requirements will increase depending on the types and numbers of policies you deploy to the agent. For the latest DLP agent system requirements, please see the Symantec Data Loss Prevention System Requirements and Compatibility Guide. After installing the required three tiers and configuring them to communicate with each other, the next step in implementing Endpoint Discover is to ensure that you have configured DLP policies that tell Symantec DLP what to look for when scanning endpoint computers. As described in the Identifying and Describing Confidential Data module of this course, Symantec DLP policies generally apply to all products in the Symantec DLP suite. For instance, a single policy can be used to detect credit card numbers across storage, network, and endpoint, with different response rules tailored to the specific Symantec DLP products you have deployed. As you configure detection rules for your DLP endpoint policies, it is important to remember that these rules are evaluated in different places depending on the detection method, which can have a significant impact on performance. Rules that are evaluated locally on the endpoint by the DLP agent provide the best performance. For Windows endpoints, local evaluation is available for DCM, Described Content Matching Rules, EMDI, Exact Match Data Identifiers Validators, IDM, Indexed Document Matching Rules, and VML, Vector Machine Learning Rules. EDM, Exact Data Matching Rules, are evaluated at the endpoint server level. This is because the indexes required for EDM would tax endpoint resources. Because EDM detection rules are evaluated at the server level, they cannot trigger endpoint quarantine or other response rules that require an immediate detection verdict from the agent. The distribution of detection analysis across server and agent according to required resources is called two-tier detection. Note that by default, the DLP agent evaluates IDM rules locally on the endpoint and performs exact file matching, that is, matching on a file's binary signature, and partial file content matching, that is, matching on discrete sections or passages of extracted and normalized file contents. It is also possible to configure two-tier IDM detection for the endpoint, where IDM rules are evaluated on the endpoint server to perform exact file content matching, or matching on 100% of extracted and normalized file contents. However, for performance reasons, Symantec recommends using local IDM matching methods on the endpoint rather than configuring two-tier IDM detection. For detection on Mac endpoints, Refer to this table to determine which types of detection the DLP agent for Mac does and does not support. Note that vector machine learning, two-tier detection EDM and IDM for exact file content matching, and DGM with a recipient based on a director server group rule and user group-based policies are not supported on Mac endpoints. After you have deployed the three-tier Symantec DLP architecture and authored policies to detect confidential files, you are ready to configure targets and run scans on endpoint computers in your organization's environment. Similar to Network Discover, Endpoint Discover requires you to configure a scan target, which in this case governs the scanning of up to thousands of endpoint computers. In the target, you will select applicable policies, specify whether the scan should be full or incremental, and optionally configure scan filters, including directory filters, file size filters, and file modification date filters. There are two methods for performing Endpoint Discover scans: scanning all endpoint computers connected to one or more endpoint servers, or targeting the scan to specific endpoint computers, identified by IP address or hostname. For the all endpoint scan method, the Endpoint Discover scan is targeted to one or more endpoint servers, and only one scan can run at a time on a server. When an endpoint server begins a scan, scan parameters are distributed to all connected DLP agents, which then scan the endpoint computer according to those parameters. All participating agents are required to run the scan unless exempted by an exclusion filter. To start or stop scanning files on an endpoint computer, an agent must be connected to an endpoint server that is included in the target configuration. Administrators can specify a time limit for scans, or can configure scans to end when endpoint servers no longer receive scan-related data from agents for a specified amount of time. For the targeted endpoint scan method, scans are sent to specific endpoint computers identified by hostname or IP address. Multiple targeted scans can be run in parallel on a single endpoint server, provided the set of agents in each scan do not overlap with other targeted scans. Note that overlapping scans are queued for the affected agents on the endpoint server. Each DLP agent scans files on its corresponding endpoint computer at a rate of approximately 5 gigabytes per hour, assuming that policies containing agent-centric detection rules such as DCM, EMDI, IDM, and VML are used. You can tune endpoint scanning performance by modifying scan target settings, for instance using include and exclude filters, agent configuration settings, for instance CPU throttling, and policy configurations. By default, the agent scans most files continuously on the endpoint while the computer is active, but waits until the endpoint computer is idle to scan larger files, thereby conserving endpoint resources while the user is active on the computer. As shown in this figure, you can also configure the agent so it does not scan the endpoint at all while the computer is active, and you can configure how the agent determines the endpoint is idle. When Endpoint Discover detects confidential files on Windows endpoint computers, it can quarantine them or apply customized automatic responses built on the Symantec DLP Flex Response API. The quarantine location can either be a secured folder on the local drive or a folder on a remote file share that is accessible to the endpoint through the corporate network. As part of the endpoint quarantine response, you can also create a marker file that replaces the quarantined file in the original location and indicates to endpoint users what happened to the original file. Endpoint quarantine is available for Windows endpoints but is not supported for Mac endpoints. Endpoint quarantine, custom flex response, and other endpoint response rules are covered in more detail in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course. To run an endpoint scan, you must first configure a target. Start by navigating to Manage, Discover Scanning, Discover Targets, and then click New Target, Endpoint File System. On the General tab, as shown in this screenshot, type a target name and select one or more policy groups to apply to the scan. If you have not created any policy groups in the Enforce Administration console, the default policy group will be used. Additionally, specify whether to execute a full scan, where all files on the endpoint computer are scanned, or an incremental scan, where the scan picks up from the location of the last successfully scanned file and only scans new or modified files. Under Scan Type, you can select the option Classify Without Generating Incidents, Classification Scan, to apply Symantec Information-Centric Tagging or ICT classification tags to the detected files without generating any incidents. Generally, you would use this option with a large-scale file tagging operation performed as part of an initial baseline Endpoint Discover scan to determine what types of information reside on endpoint computers in your organization, and to classify them accordingly. The requirements for using this option are 1. A separate license for Symantec ICT, 2. An ICT classification taxonomy imported to the Enforce server, and 3. A configured endpoint ICT classification and tagging response rule applied to a DLP policy. Details on using Symantec DLP response rules to apply ICT tags to files on the endpoint are provided in the Preventing Unauthorized Exposure of Confidential Data module of this course. On the Targeting tab shown in this screenshot, select at least one endpoint server. Note that if you were configuring an all-endpoint scan rather than a targeted scan, you would only select one or more endpoint servers but would not specify any endpoints. Specify endpoint targets by manually entering endpoint hostnames or IP addresses, separated by spaces, commas, or new lines. Or you can import a CSV file with this information. Symantec recommends specifying hostnames rather than IP addresses for a couple of reasons. First, if endpoints are behind a proxy server, IP addresses might reflect the proxy addresses rather than the addresses of actual endpoint computers. And second, the endpoint server resolves IP addresses to hostnames anyway, so specifying hostnames to begin with saves a step. Note that you can delete endpoints or edit hostnames or IP addresses in the agent list. On the Filters tab, shown in this screenshot, configure any include or exclude filters, or file size filters and file date filters as needed. Endpoint Discover target filters limit or specify exactly what type of files you scan, and the areas within the target you want to scan, as well as the size of the files you want to scan. Endpoint Discover targets are dedicated to a specific local system. This means that, unlike Network Discover, endpoint targets do not need to be defined by root systems or shares. As shown in this figure, you can use environment variables to create Endpoint Discover scans that target or exclude specific file locations regardless of the OS version, user profile, or platform of the endpoint. Variables that include or exclude user profile paths are resolved to all the user profiles present on the endpoint. These paths can be defined by either Symantec DLP or the operating system. Note that for filtering by file type on Mac endpoints, the DLP agent only considers file extensions, .txt, .docx, .pdf, so on. It does not examine file signatures to determine true file type. For instance, if a user had renamed a sample.txt file to sample.png, the DLP agent for Mac would identify the file's type as PNG, not as the true file type, a plain text.txt file. The Advanced tab enables you to specify how scans end. You can configure the scan to end when endpoint servers receive no scan information from any endpoint agents for a specified length of time, marked as scan idle timeout, and you can configure the scan to end when a specific amount of time has elapsed since the start of the scan, the max scan duration field. To run an Endpoint Discover target scan, select the target on the Discover Targets page and click the Play button. Note that you cannot schedule Endpoint Discover scans, meaning that each scan must be started manually. During a scan and after a scan is complete, the target page will list various scan details for this scan, including a scan progress bar, the runtime of the scan, how many items have been scanned, how many bytes have been scanned, the number of errors, if any, and the number of incidents, if any. You can view detailed information about each Endpoint Discover scan, including general scan information, scan statistics, recent errors, and scan activity. You can also download reports in CSV format for scan statistics, recent errors, and scan activity. To view scan details, go to Manage, Discover Scanning, Scan History, select the scan, and then click the link in the Scan Status column. Endpoint Discover incidents are grouped with Network Discover incidents in the Enforce reporting UI. To access Endpoint Discover incidents, navigate to Incidents, Discover, and then filter the incident list on the relevant endpoint targets, as shown in this figure. Incident snapshots are relatively consistent across products in the Symantec DLP suite. Therefore, Endpoint Discover incidents appear fairly similar to Network Discover and Cloud Storage Discover incidents. There are certain endpoint-specific features of the incident snapshot, such as the endpoint file path, as depicted in this figure. Note that more details about incident snapshots and incident reporting in general are provided in the Remediating Data Loss Incidents and Tracking Risk Reduction module of this course. To review, confidential data at rest represents a significant data loss risk for any organization. Confidential files in on-premise repositories such as file servers and SharePoint servers can easily proliferate and end up in open shares or shares with loose permissions, and from there quickly leave your network unauthorized on USB devices, outbound communications, etc. Such repositories are also ripe targets for malicious insiders or outsiders looking for your organization's most valuable confidential data. Confidential files residing in cloud storage accounts may be shared with external partners and others and quickly escape your control. Finally, confidential files copied over time to hundreds or thousands of laptops can go missing through laptop theft or loss, or by well-meaning insiders copying or sending the data from their computers. Data loss prevention programs sometimes emphasize data in motion, leaving your network through email or web transmissions. But data at rest is just one click away from becoming data in motion. Therefore, securing your data at rest is central to a comprehensive data loss prevention effort. This module has covered some important tools for assessing risk related to confidential data at rest and taking the first steps towards remediating that risk. We emphasize the need for drafting a list of repositories to scan, noting that such a list requires input from various data owners and other stakeholders in your organization. We have covered Network Discover scans of on-premise file servers, SharePoint servers, Exchange servers, and SQL databases. We discussed the importance of locating confidential data in cloud storage accounts using Symantec DLP Cloud Storage Discover. We also talked about using Endpoint Discover to identify confidential data on endpoint computers in your network. Protecting all these repositories and local drives requires configuration of the appropriate target, followed by scans, often ongoing incremental scans, to pinpoint confidential data across your network. Using Symantec DLP Network Discover, Cloud Storage Discover, and Endpoint Discover to assess your risks related to loss of data at rest is a critical step in your data loss prevention program. Specific product features for securing such data, such as quarantining it to a secure location, were also introduced in this module and will be discussed in further detail in later modules of this course. For additional information on these topics, please reference the Symantec Data Loss Prevention Administration Guide, the System Requirements and Compatibility Guide, the Deployment Guide for Amazon Web Services, as well as the online help and knowledge base found at support.symantec.com. Thank you for joining us. This concludes the Locating Confidential Data Stored On-Premise and in the Cloud module of the Symantec Data Loss Prevention 15.5 Administration course.